Hello guys, today I'm going to teach you the French defense, and that's in a few minutes, so let's get started right away. The French defense starts with e4, e6, d4 and d5. And now as black we have achieved the basic position of the French defense, and remarkable is that we have a very strong black bishop and kind of a poor white bishop. And this is because of the pawns e6 and d5, preventing our white bishop from getting out of his cave. So this is one thing we have to consider in the French opening. Now in this basic position, after move 2, white has a few moves that we are going to take a closer look at. First is takes d5, then there is e5, also knight c3 and knight d2. Starting with the move takes d5, and we take back with the pawn. Now we have the exchange variation, and you can already see that it is kind of symmetrical. Here white often plays knight f3 or bishop d3. And the idea of bishop d3 is to prevent black from playing bishop f5 by himself and getting a good square for the bishop. After bishop d3, we are playing bishop d6 to prevent white from playing bishop f4, and after knight f3, we play knight e7. The other ideas that I have already marked are something like knight c6, bishop g4, and queen d7. Moves that we will see in the other line, which is knight f3 first. And then, like in the other line, we're playing bishop d6, preventing bishop f4 from white, bishop d3, and now we play knight e7, and you might first think that knight on e7 is kind of inferior to the knight on f3, because it's not on f6, but I would only agree with you if we would castle short. Then the knight on f6 is better than the knight on e7. Nevertheless, we are not going to castle short, but long, and then the knight on e7 is kind of good, and it has opportunities to go to g6 or f5 or support the bishop in doing so. For example, short castling by white, and then something like bishop g4, applying pressure on the knight, rook e1, and afterwards we play knight c6, attacking the d4 pawn and threatening knight to b4. White pretty much has to play c3 in order to prevent both, and we play queen to d7 and preparing our king to castle long. For example, knight to d2, and now it's completed, and we have oppositional castlings. And now, after our development, our plan is to attack the white king on the king side with a pawn rush, for example f6, g5, and h5 following. Another idea is to play with your pieces and to attack the weak squares that white has on his king side, which is f4. And white can actually play something like b5 and try to attack us on the queen side with his pawns and his queen, but it's not very dangerous, and we can simply go on attacking our opponent. For example, something like rook b1, knight f4, bishop f1, f6, just a few moves to show you the basic plan. h3 is kind of bad, because after g5, h5, and g4, white is actually nearly forced to exchange and open up the h file, so h3 just a very bad move. And you will see that white is almost finished, and we can open up the h file or the g file and attack the king on the king side, which is very strong. It's kind of an example of how you can play kind of an easy game and still get very much pressure on the white king. It's simply achieved by having an aggressive approach, which is casting opposite sides. And all moves we did beforehand were to increase the pressure on white and to pursue this idea. So what do you have to remember when playing the exchange variation? First, play the bishop behind your little pawn and prevent white from playing bishop f4, and if he lets you, for example, he plays something like c3, then of course you can play bishop f5. And then we play knight e7 and prepare our king to castle alongside. Now we have pretty much every plan. We can play f6, g5, h5, or we can play our idea with knight g6, knight f4. That's the basic things you have to remember when playing the exchanged variation. Now the second variation, which is the advanced variation, and like its name, white is not exchanging but going advanced with e5. And now he has kind of a strong center, so it's immediately an approach to attack it with something like c5 and weaken up his pawns. If we play something like knight f3, we can simply take the pawn and we will lose up the e5 pawn in the long run, so he will have problems to defend it, and yeah, in a few moves we can actually win it with our knight and our queen. So white has to protect the pawn by playing something like c3, and we increase the pressure on the pawn, something like knight f3, queen b6, still increasing. And now in this position there are a lot of moves white can actually play. For example, something like bishop e2, bishop d3, h3, something like takes on d5, even something like g3 or something like knight a3 is possible in this position. So if you want to take a closer look in this, then we will do another video on it, but I will focus only on two moves to make the video as short as possible for you to learn it as a beginner. Bishop e2, for example. Now we play cd4, cd4, and knight to e7, and develop our knight to g6 or f5, and apply great pressure on the d4 pawn. Now you might ask, why don't we play knight e7 immediately? Well, the answer is that now our pawn on c5 is a little bit loosened up, and white can take, and our queen is getting a little bit uncomfortable on c5. So we want to first take and afterwards play the knight to e7, so our queen still applies pressure to d4 but is not hunted by herself. And second question, why do we develop our knight if our bishop is free to go? Well, the answer is if we just develop our bishop, our knight has no opportunities to get out. On h6, it would be taken by the bishop on c1, and on e7 there's a bishop already standing, so we have problems developing our pieces further on. So we first play our knight to its destination and afterwards playing the bishop. Something like castling is already bad because of knight f5 and d4 is hanging. So you have to play something like knight a3 with the idea of playing knight c2, and now bishop b4 giving a check. If white takes, then we're again winning the d4 pawn and having a free pawn on d5, which is kind of strong. And even bishop d2 is a bad move because we can win the pawn on b2, and being a pawn up is always a great idea. So the only way of white playing and not having a worse position is king f1. But still, I would pretty much favor black here because he has simply no bad pieces at all. Maybe the bishop on c8, but it will eventually develop and we will have an open c-file that we can occupy with our rook. And the king of f1 is not the greatest, so I think I will favor black here, but you can write in the comments what you think about this position. That's the ideas after bishop e2. Now the second most important move is a3, not knight a3, but pawn to a3. And the idea is to play b4 and gain space on the queen side. And of course we have to prevent white from doing so by playing c4. Now we gain a very strong square on b3, which we want to occupy with our knight or our bishop from c8. For example, knight to d2, knight a5, bishop to e2, bishop to d7, and you see where it's going. And last but not least, our pieces on the king side also have to be developed sometimes. So in this line, after a3 and c4, we first develop our queen side and later on our king side. And you will see soon why. We go back with the queen, but we don't just go back, but we make place and for our knight because it wants to go from c8 to b6 and help the bishop from d7 to go to a4. That's the deep idea after knight c7. Something like b1, knight c8, knight f1, knight b6, bishop to a4, knight to b3, knight to g3, bishop a4, and now we are going to castle long and play on the queen side. And this is pretty much everything you have to know. We leave the king side for a moment, maybe we play h6, but we are not going to attack very aggressively on the king side, more on the queen side. Maybe we play the knight back someday and play b5, a5, b4, who knows, but our major plan will be to increase the pressure on the queen side. That's pretty much we can do in this very short lecture about the French opening in the advanced variation. Again, if you want to take a closer look also in the other moves and in the lines we've looked at, but in more detail, then write it in the comments and subscribe so we can do a longer video on it. But that's the most important thing about the advanced variation. We play c5 and applying pressure on d4. It's pretty much always about pressure and attacking your opponent. And knight c3 and queen b6 are important, and then we just try to develop our pieces after bishop e2 with takes and the knight, and after a3 we're going to play with our pieces on the queen side. Alright, off we go to the next variation. which is the Rubinstein variation, and this is started by a knight move on c3 or a knight move on d2. Usually these two moves make a huge difference, but not in the Rubinstein variation, because we are simply going to take on e4, and now it's kind of not important where the knight is coming from d2 or from c3. I don't care, the knight is on e4 right now. Of course, after something like knight c3, knight f6, we have a completely different position, and something like e5 could be played, or something like bishop b4 is possible in this position, but it's kind of complicated, and for this line, or for this video, I want to give you just a very simple guide that you can follow, and we don't want to go too much in theory, so we just simply play take c4 and simplify two lines to one line. And this is also played by super grandmasters, for example Blühbaum. He has something like 2650 elo, and he is considered as one of the specialists of the Rubinstein variation, and he plays it quite frequently. Now we play something like knight to d7, and our idea is to play knight to f6. Why don't we do it immediately? Because white could take, and we don't actually want to take back with the queen, because then our queen is in a kind of bad position. We don't want it to be on f6, we want there a knight and not a queen, so we prepare the move knight f6 first with the move knight to d7. Knight f3, knight f7, something like bishop to d3, takes, and something like knight f6, bishop to d3, and here black has several ideas, for example c5, and takes, short castling, and now we want to actually develop our bad pieces on c8 and a8, so we play b6 and get our bishop to the long diagonal, bishop g5, bishop b7. Now be careful, white is threatening bishop h7, so get the queen out of the way, and bishop f6, gf6 is not really a danger or a threat, because it's only weak if you can attack it. That's a very classic sentence in chess. Something is only weak if you can attack it. Our king, you could say that it's weak, but you can't really attack it, so it's not really weak anymore. So don't be scared to play something like this. And we now have fully developed our pieces. We have a pair of bishops, and maybe we want to play something like queen f4. And I personally really would favor black here, because I think in the middle game you have a lot of opportunities to make your opponents a hard time and create issues. But maybe you don't want to play c5 immediately, so there's also a different move in this position, which is b6. And all you do is pretty much delaying c5, and you play it later on if you are more prepared, or you play something completely else. For example, you want to play something like knight to d5 or bishop d5 or even queen to d5 is an idea. And of course playing c5 also. Takes. Now we don't can play knight to d5 anymore, but this position is also quite good, and we go to the e7 with our queen first and then play c5. We cannot do it immediately because of the ongoing bishop h7 threat, but something like, I don't know, rook e1, knight to e7, queen to e7, and now c5. And this position is very good. Black has equalized completely. We could also say that we're not worse, but maybe even better because our pair of bishops. So I think it's very good position, and I would favor black here. Alright, I think that's mostly it. You now have learned 3 variations. First the exchange variation, then the advanced variation, now the Rubinstein variation in the French opening. So again, our aim is mostly to play the move c5 and develop our very weak bishop on c8, and this is through the moves b6 and bishop b7. So we can first play c5, or we can first play b6 and bishop b7. Both of these plans have to be somehow played. Which you play first really doesn't really matter, but you have to play them both at some point, and then you not only equalize but can play for the win. Alright, I hope you now understand the French opening a little bit better and maybe try it in your next few Blitz games. And as I have already mentioned earlier, if you want to take a closer look into some lines and you have not the feeling that you learned enough about the French opening, you can write a comment, subscribe, and I make another video, but in more depth. Yeah, that's basically it. Like and subscribe if you like this video, and yeah, see you next time. Bye bye.